Welcome and thank you for attending tonight. And I'd first like to thank Amber, Clark County Museum. Thank you so much for co-partnering with HHS. And now I'd like to thank our speakers, Jim, Mark, and Eric. I know it's a huge effort. One of you came from, what, Reno? Yeah. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Just a few announcements that I have that I'd like to let you know what we're up to, which is a lot. Our next Henderson Speaks event is Saturday, April 18th, historic bus tour that goes through the gates into the BMI plant. The plant manager is going to hop on the bus and give a tour and talk. And we had great success last year that the first bus sold out within 2 weeks. So this year, one bus is sold out and we're waiting for the second bus to be sold out too. So I've got great expectations for that. Home and History Week in Henderson, we have a pub crawl on Water Street that is Thursday, April 16th, starting at 6 p.m. April 17th and 18th, we have a historic walking tour through the former Black Mountain Golf Course and Country Club. One of our homes are opened up for a tour inside from 9 to 11, and thank you them. Friday, April 24th, we will be having our Pioneer event, and we will be combining the event with our meet and greet candidates night. And this will be held at Eagles Hall, Van Wagenen and Pacific, and that starts at 6 p.m. So if you have any questions for your candidate, this is the time to do it. For any tickets for your event, please go to nevadapreservation.org. It gives a whole lot of more explanation of what's what, but I gave you just a little synopsis tonight. But thank you again for coming. We really appreciate it. And now I'm going to hand it to Amber.
And let's hear it for the Henderson Historical Society for keeping local Henderson history alive and active and accessible. We love partnering with you because A, you bring a really good crowd. How many of you guys are part of Henderson Historical Society? Quite a bit of you guys. Thank you guys for coming out. I'd also like to ask, how many of you guys have been to Clark County Museum in the last 5 years? Awesome, that's amazing. Welcome back. For those that haven't, we're constantly having changes happen here. We are your community museum. We are taxpayer revenue taxpayer funded. So your taxes go directly to us providing a service for you. And one of those ways we get support for that is showing that people are coming out. They're interested in. So you guys are helping us fight for our cause, essentially, to be here for the rest of time to support our community. Some other programs coming up, of course, if you haven't visited already, we have the Empowered Women of Clark County exhibit that just opened on March 6th. It will be open till May 25th. Shortly thereafter, we will be opening an exhibit on Juneteenth that will also feature a lecture in this hall too. Hopefully the air conditioner will be fixed by then because it's probably going to be this hot or hotter. But we have an exhibit that's going to be focusing on African American cotillions nationally and locally as well. So it's going to be a really unique exhibit that we're actually renting to come out and actually show a little bit of the culture that we have locally here in Las Vegas, I think since 1963. So come out for that as well. We are also partnering with Nevada Preservation Foundation for Home and History. So the bus tour will actually be taking off from our parking lot. And then also we will be featuring a tour, guided tours of the Howard Hughes home, which is located on the Channel 8 campus. So it's behind the studio. It was built in 1951, used by Howard Hughes in 1953, 1954. We have started to exhibit it as we hope it's kind of an aspiration of what it might look like or could look like when it moves here to the museum. We are currently fundraising for that project. So tours are still available for that as well. I encourage you to do the bus tour and everything for Home and History. It's really a good way to get active in our history. I'd like to thank all the museum staff here. We are small staff, but we are strong and mighty. Everyone does a little bit of everything. along with our volunteers. Without our volunteers, we would not be here, and without our volunteer guild. The Clark County Museum Guild is the one that supports us behind the scenes. They're the ones that fund a lot of our projects that are extra, and of course, Henderson Historical Society for partnering with us every year, and also providing the refreshments for this evening. So thank you for that. So before we get going, I kind of want to talk a little bit of background of how we came to get these three gentlemen up here to talk a bit. Last year, if you remember, we did a panel on Henderson and Boulder City becoming the World War II heritage cities for Nevada. When we started discussing that, so we talk about basic magnesium a lot, right, here in Henderson, but it's a bigger picture. So we started looking at what is that bigger picture? Of course, the magnesite was mined in Gabbs, Nevada. What does that process look like, and where does it go? I had all these questions, and I figured if I had these questions, other people have these questions. So we started this over a year ago discussion, and we started thinking about who we wanted on our panel, and we identified these three gentlemen. So tonight with us, we have Eric Nystrom, and he is an associate professor, graduate, and he's a graduate program director at UNR. Don't hold it against him. He did graduate from UNLV with his bachelor's and his master's, and followed up and got his PhD from the Johns Hopkins University. He's a historian of science and technology who specializes in the history of mining. His first book, which we sell in our gift shop, is called Seeing Underground, Maps, Models, and Mining Engineering in America, and it examines the importance of visual tools in the emergence of the American mining profession. It also won the Clark C. Spence Award from the Mining History Association. Eric is also the founder and editor of a book series, Mining and Society, published by the University of Nevada Press, and has served as the president of the Mining History Association and trustee for the National Susan B. Anthony Museum and House. And then in the middle here, you guys don't know this guy at all. He's new to you. His name is Mark Hall Patton. I follow in his footsteps. He's the retired museum administrator. I did not get the hat when he retired. One day maybe. He is also the previous director of the San Luis Obispo County Historical Museum in California. He is a map surveyor for the American Allegiance of Museums and author of 4 books, over 450 published articles, 85 monographs on local history subjects, and has written and produced 48 local history videos. And I think that's increased since then, 'cause you have your YouTube channel now as well. He has also appeared on American Restoration, United Stuff of America, America Facts and Facilities, 10 Things You Didn't Know About American History, Vegas PBS, TMZ Sports, interesting one, C-SPAN 3, so. Mysteries at the Museum, Hoarders, ABC 2020, and the Art Channel of France. He holds his bachelor's degree in history from the University of California at Irvine and did graduate work in museum studies at the University of Delaware. In 2022, he was honored as the Distinguished Nevadan of the Year by the Nevada State System of Higher Education. And at the end of the table here, we have Jim Fluke. He is a historian for the 99th Air Base Wing, which has a base operations support mission supporting 6 wings and 52 tenant units at Nellis Air Force Base. He authors the wing commander's official history documenting the why and how of missions execution. Mr. Fluke provides historical perspective and institutional memory to wings, groups, and squadron commanders to enhance their decision making. Prior to his current position, he was a park ranger at Sloan Canyon National Conservation Area and at Gettysburg National Military Park. He also has taught 2 collegiate courses in U.S. history. His research interests include America Civil War era, legal constitutional history, air power, leadership, and decision making. He has his bachelor's degree from the Pennsylvania State University, his master's from the University of Florida in Gainesville, and has also had gotten his interdisciplinary certificate concentrated in historical preservation from the University of Florida, Gainesville. Please give our panelists a round of applause. So I introduced the topic a little bit about how we came about wanting to talk about this. And we're actually going to start with Eric, because the process all starts with, where do we get the magnesium? Why are we getting the magnesium? What is that mining process, Eric?
Yeah, so the mining process, I mean, you think about it this way, partly, and I apologize, I think probably like a lot of folks, I need readers, but I don't have bifocals yet, and so it's constantly one of these off and on my face things. But, you know, if we think about mining at some level, this is a thing that anybody does anytime, anywhere you're talking about human habitation, right? If you can't grow it, you got to mine it. There's no way around that iron law. And so mining touches, I think, everyday life in a way that is far more subtle than most of us really recognize. On one hand, it's remarkably simple. It's digging stuff up out of the ground, or sometimes it's just scraping off the surface of the earth. But then in other ways, it ends up being, for example, after a number of processes or whatever, it becomes materials that are incredibly useful to mankind. And so that fundamental tension between something that's on one hand so simple and so sort of base level, if you will, and something that is really highly technologically advanced at the forefront of material science, and in our case, at the forefront of waging and winning a war in World War II. That, to me, that's the creative tension that makes mining history so interesting. And so, you know, I thought about, like, what is it that we're all talking about here? And I think in some ways that our story can really be summarized pretty easily. It's a form that you might have heard many times, right? Here it goes. I'm going to give you the two-sentence version, something like this. Anticipating U.S. entry into the war, the government created a mine and a huge plant to make magnesium. That plant created the town of Henderson and helped win World War II. Done. Okay, so we can all go home now. So that's true, right? Obviously that's true, and I think most of us probably already know that. But I suspect that we all think that there's something a little more valuable to be gained from a slightly closer look, a little more detailed investigation. And in thinking over this question of, you know, what really matters about these particular stories, it seemed to me that there are a number of good answers. And so I wanted to throw these out, and I should say in advance that we did not collaborate on these, and so if they disagree with me, I welcome that. I think that these kinds of robust debates are really helpful in showing the kind of messy process of figuring out why our history matters. Not just that it was some time ago, but like, what should we be getting out of it, right? So at least a few good answers. So one, of course, the speed and dedication of the workers, their contribution to the war effort, the source of knowledge and pride in our predecessors, right? That's one good answer to all this. But I mean, I think a second one is the transformative effects on Nevada in general and on Las Vegas in particular. And I think most of this is going to be Mark's bailiwick, you know, population and the racial diversity that comes with this, the formation of Henderson, the creation of heavy industry in Nevada, the essential infrastructure, and so on. But then the one that sort of intrigues me perhaps the most are what might be a little bit more hidden stories, things that might make us view this history in a slightly different way than before. And to me, I'm thinking of a handful of things. I'll throw these out here and maybe tackle one of them. But one is the importance of the period before World War II. We are telling a wartime story, and yet the most important period in certain ways is what happened before that war started. Second, I think a hidden story that might make us view this a little differently, the importance of political action in the development of the state. And then the third is the role of that technical expertise. Not that technical expertise, the role of technical expertise in making all of this kind of stuff happen. And I do think, and I might be jumping right to the conclusion here, that there are some ways in which that these debates, this history, has some power in today's discourse, in today's conversations that are that really is new, I think. I think we might have imagined that this stuff was old hat, and I don't think it is anymore. So those are some sort of broad-based kinds of questions, and I think that pre-war period, if we could step back just a little bit, right? So I want to put a pin in where we are. You know, as a historian, we're always talking about chronology, and I think of it as, you know, almost like the slider on a movie. Where do we actually start the thing? And so if we go back to the 1940s, you know, we've got, if you know anything about the chronology that happens here, probably the most important little weird tweak is that this all gets rolling before the United States gets involved in World War II, officially, right? So if I ask any of my students, when did World War II begin for the United States? The answer is Pearl Harbor, right? Day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941. But this process starts before that. And I think Mark is going to speak to that at least a little bit. And so partly when we think, well, why does it start before that? Well, you know, I mean, Americans weren't blind. We knew that Nazis were you know, in Europe. They invaded Poland in September of 1939. We knew that was happening. The fall of France, and then Dunkirk, and then, you know, the Battle of Britain and all this stuff. We knew that there was something going on. In fact, in 1940, we instituted a peacetime draft. America was not at war, and yet we were drafting people into the United States Army. You sit on that for a second, right? I mean, that's kind of a pretty bold step when you think about it. And so clearly the policymakers were at least some policymakers, I should say, because there wasn't a consensus. Some folks said we should stay out of wars. These are European fights, not ours. But at least among some people who were in charge in FDR's government there was a sense that we were going to need to prepare. And so that's one way in which this is a pre-war story, right? But I think that when we kick this off, let's say we kick it off in 41, there's still a story before that, right? And that to me is the mining piece. So there's mining in the area that becomes gabbs, dating back to the 19th century. They find a little bit of gold and silver. They find, you know, in the early part of the 20th century, they find a tungsten mine. And one of the guys who's working one of these little tungsten mines, his name is Harry Springer. He sees something funky coming out of the rock. What's this? And he chips off a piece of it and sends it off to be analyzed. And it turns out it's brucite. Okay. Anyone happen to know what brucite is? Well, actually, you can probably hazard a guess because we're here talking about magnesium, right? You know, turns out it's magnesium ore. Okay, fine. What do you do with that? Well, no one really knows. So like any good Nevadan, it looked like there was a lot of it, and so he thought maybe it's valuable, and he put down some claims and mostly held on to those. So this is in the 1920s, 2 decades before all this gets going. In the 1930s, a company comes, or in the 1930s, there's some movement, right? There's a little bit more development, raises a little financing. The University of Nevada sends some geologists down to take a look at this stuff. They say, my golly, we got a pretty fine brucite deposit here, and there's some magnesite as well. What do we do with this? Well, there aren't a whole lot of things that you do with magnesium, but you know, it's here. That's good. You never know. I mean, there are lots of deposits in Nevada full of all kinds of materials that maybe we don't really know what to do with them. Lithium, for example. What do you do with lithium anyway? I mean, I guess eventually you figure out how to make grease out of it. You know, so you got a great big pile of stuff that you can use for grease. You use it in aluminum refining. Can anyone think of any other things to do with lithium? I don't know. You know, but they figured it out. It's there. You know, and one of these publications that was done by the University of Nevada gets picked up by one of the national mining publications. Well, there's a big magnesium deposit, and it gets read by a guy who runs a company in Cleveland, and this guy makes bricks. He's a brick maker. I mean, well, he owns a company. He's actually a rather rich man, but his company makes bricks. But they're very specific bricks. They are the bricks that go inside steel open hearth furnaces, and people figure out in the late 19th and early 20th century, as if you look at a graph of steel production worldwide, as I'm sure many of you have done, you know, there's this huge increase in steel production. And part of the reason why is they figure out how to do this efficiently. Part of that reason why is that they figured out how to deal with ores that when you heat them up, they create acid. Like, has anyone ever heard of acid mine drainage, right? You know, you get rock in contact with the air or with water, and it creates acid. Okay, well, this will tend to eat the inside of your furnace. Fine, okay. If somebody comes up with a great idea, why don't we put something that is not acid but alkaline in the very bricks that make up the inside of a steel furnace? And then they'll withstand higher temperature and they'll last longer. And the real issue with furnaces like that is that you have to cool them down to fix them, and that takes a lot of time and money. So they call that refractory brick. So this guy comes up with he's one of the several manufacturers of refractory brick, and it turns out that one of the key ingredients in making good refractory, basic as opposed to acidic brick is magnesium. And here in the mining literature in the 1930s, somebody says, well, we got a whole pile of magnesium out in the middle of nowhere in Nevada. Okay. So he sends a guy named Norman Hansen out here to take a look at it in 1937. And Hansen sniffs around in Tonopah and figures out who owns those claims. Harry Springer goes up to Mina, finds Springer and says, can you show me the stuff? And he said, okay, yeah, no problem. And he takes him out there, looks the stuff over. There'd been a couple of drill holes, looks at diamond drill cores, and he says, yeah, it was pretty good. So his company takes a lease on Springer's claims, a 35-year lease, which is, for all intents and purposes, as long as anyone really needs. And while he's out there, Hansen also kind of stakes a few other claims. It looks like not all the ground is tied up. And they start a mine. It's called the Brucite mine. So Brucite and magnesite were the two kinds of magnesium ores that were found in this area. Big, world-class deposits of this stuff. Right at the surface, basically all you got to do is use a little bulldozer and scrape it out, pretty much. Maybe you blast it, something like that. And so they start mining this stuff in the 30s, and it's as simple an operation as you can imagine. They loosen it up a little bit with explosives, and then they load it into a truck, and they truck it over an incredibly bad road to Luning, which some of you might have passed through Luning if you've ever driven US 95. Not a lot there, but they would transfer it on Luning to the train and ship it off to Ohio. And then they'd make it into bricks, and there you go. That's all it was. That's all it was. They employed, at first, maybe about 8 guys. So you have to have a cook, They eventually worked their way up to about 15, something like that, and add a few more claims. And so they're sitting on all this material, and they're just kind of doing their thing. And that's when these war clouds sort of arrive on the horizon. And the guy who owns Basic Refractories, Howard, right?
Howard Eels.
Howard Eels, yeah. He knows that magnesium has other uses. Other people actually did too. In fact, I found an article in the Nevada State Journal. It's half of the predecessor to the modern Reno Gazette Journal, from 1928, from a mining engineer in Tonopah, who, among other things, was spent time in prison for trying to sell shares of a mine that he didn't own. Colorful folks. But he said, in the 1920s, so in other words, this deposit was known, but no one had done anything with it yet. He said, someday Nevada might be a major producer of this stuff. You can make alloys out of magnesium. Germany is making alloys. They're also making munitions out of magnesium. Maybe we should pay attention to this. This might be really valuable. He was, he may have been a crook, but he was a forward thinker. And so with that, I think I'll pause for the moment and send it to my colleagues. But it's interesting to imagine how much effort and thought, how much was known about this magnesium before the war really began.
Well, I hope you noticed a name in there. He had this Howard Eels, who was investing in these brucite and magnesite claims. He wasn't out there. He didn't mine himself. No, he was just the money man. But he had this company that was Basic Refractories, that basic name, which referred to them being base and
Alkaline.
not acidic.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you ever wonder about that basic name, it's one of those things. I like names. I like where names come from. But anyways, Eels ended up as the war is coming on, he gets in touch with a fellow named Major John P. Bell. Now, Major John P. Bell has been also interested in magnesium, and he's been working with a company in England who had bought the plans at the end of World War I from Germany on how to produce magnesium. Because magnesium is not easy to make out of magnesite. It was a material that wasn't easy to render out of the ore. But at the end of World War I, basically Germany had to give up everything. You know, that was one of the things that happened at the end of World War I. So they had to give it all up. So England took this process. Okay, we're going to take the process of how to make magnesium. We're not quite sure what we're going to do, but we're taking that too. And so there was a company called Magnesium Electron Limited, because it's England, so it's limited. And he, Major Bell, gets this process, he buys it, and so Eels gets involved, and he buys the whole process. And this is crates and crates and crates of plans for a plant. And he says, okay, ship them to me in the United States. This is in 1940. There's this little dust up going on over in Europe. We're not part of it yet. We haven't been attacked yet, so we're not part of it. But, you know, we want to have all these plans over here, and Eels wants to build a plant. And he gets the money to build a plant from the government, and they're going to build a plant somewhere. And we have a senator here in Nevada who is real good at bringing home the bacon. And some of you may have heard of him. His name was Patrick McCarran. And Patrick McCarran was really good at bringing home the bacon. So he wants that plant to be here in Nevada. But where are you going to put it? Well, we've got this spot in southern Nevada where there ain't nothing. There's just a whole bunch of nothing here. But one of the things we do know about this plant that's going to hopefully get built is it needs a whole lot of water and a whole lot of electricity. And one thing we've got here is this big chunk of concrete that's holding back a river with a whole bunch of water behind it, and it makes a whole bunch of electricity. So it could be built here. So Patrick McCarran is pushing to build the plant here. So they say, okay, send the plans over here. They put it on a ship. They ship it across the Atlantic Ocean. That ship gets hit by a couple of torpedoes, and it goes to the bottom. Those plans do not make it to the United States. So what do? Well, they turn around, make another set of plans, because those were copies, they weren't the originals. They make another set of plans. They split them up into a couple of aircraft, send them over to the United States by air, and then send the engineers on yet another aircraft to the United States. And those are the ones that make it here. And they decide that they're going to build basic magnesium here in southern Nevada. You notice that name? Yeah, basic magnesium. Amazing where that comes from. Because Howard Eels is the one who's going to be behind that. And he gets the money to build that from the War Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which is one of the committees that's one of the alphabet committees under Roosevelt. And gets the money, they start laying things out here, and there's nothing here, right? So they're going to build this huge plant. and they're going to bring all this stuff down from gabbs and process it here. But you got to have some place to put people, because there's no housing for anybody here. What kind of housing do you have? You've got Pittman, and you've got Railroad Pass, and you've got some culverts and places like that. There's almost no place for people. So they eventually decide to build basic town site and, Victory Village and all of this, but they create a community here that we think of as Henderson today, but that's not what it was. It was basic town site for basic magnesium. And they start shipping down this magnesite, but they're going to drive it down here. And by the way, I've done all those roads. I've been to Looning, I've been to Mina, I've actually put up some plaques up there.
Excellent.
But yeah, it's quite the place to drive to, you're right. But it's one of these things when you're driving, and they were driving truck after truck, once they got everything up and running, this was not a pleasant place to be. I talked to a guy one time who was shipped out here because he didn't want to go to college. And it was late 1941, and his father said, okay, you don't want to go to college? I've got a job for you. And he shipped him out here to help lay out this new plant here. And he said, I worked there for 2 months and went back home and I went to college. So just a thing. But they came out here. Basic Magnesium starts building on September 15, 1941. By December, there were 2,700 laborers here. But there was still no housing. They started putting up tents. They did everything they could to try to find some kind of housing. People were living in tents. They were literally living in culverts. Any place they could find for housing. It was not fun. Pittman provided what housing they could, not to mention the bars and all of that they could. But basic town site got its start in early 42. And everything, they started building up. Eventually, by 1944, basic town site needed a name other than basic town site. And they named it Henderson. Named it for Clarence B. Henderson. Salute. Clarence B. Henderson was a senator from Nevada, but from northern Nevada. And you have to give the guy credit. He never bothered to come here. He was the one that ran the War Reconstruction Finance Corporation for the government at that point. So they said, well, we'll name it for you because you're from Nevada. But what he did do is he sent an autographed photograph to the community. And as I understand it, the city of Henderson still has that photograph. So that's all Henderson ever got from Clarence. But they built it up. They were bringing in workers from everywhere. One of the things they did was bring in a lot of black workers and gave them the worst possible jobs that they could. In 1943, they went on strike so that they didn't have to be in segregated changing rooms, and they would get a slight increase, and they got at least that, but it wasn't much. When they went on strike, they actually sent in troops to surround them, and sent troops to Boulder City to surround the black troops that were there, sent white troops to Boulder City to surround the black troops so they wouldn't go over to help the black workers that were on strike. In case you don't think that we had some issues there with black and white issues at that point. But they did build basic town site out of demountable housing because it was built to be a community that was going to go away. The whole idea was this was not going to be a community that would exist after the end of the war. It was going to make all this magnesium so that we would have plenty of magnesium to, well, burn down most of Japan and a pretty good chunk of Germany, which it did. They did, and I've got it written down because I wouldn't remember it otherwise, 166,325,685 pounds of magnesium was smelted here. So that's why I can't remember it if I don't write it down. But they smelted that much here. They had all the workers that they could possibly find. They also had a lot of women working here, the magnesium Maggies that worked in the plant. And this was all that was going on, and they shut the plant down in late 1944. They had produced enough magnesium for what they figured was needed. Now, it should also be noted that this project was considered one of the worst projects for costing too much in World War II. This was one of those that when the Truman Commission was going around and looking at cost overruns, this was one of those projects that they considered one of the worst ones in the United States, because they were just throwing money at it to make it work. And you do that, people are going to take the money that you throw at them. You know, I won't talk about today, but I don't think that's changed. But one of the things that they didn't think about is, and by the way, when they shut down the plant, about 2/3 of the population left. 2/3 of the population of Henderson left because their jobs went away. But 1/3 of the population didn't. They'd set down roots here, they had businesses here, and they didn't want to leave. And so at the end of the war, they said, no, we're not going anywhere. We've got a community, we want it to be a community. And they continued to push to still be a community here. And with Senator McCarran, they got the ability to continue as a community. McCarran was not able to get them any money, but he was able to throw federal land at them. And the way that Henderson was able to continue to exist as a community, because what the federal government said was, well, this is all federal surplus. And they literally put together a brochure and said, it's up for sale, guys. Who wants to buy the plant and the community? And you could have come in here as a company and bought all the plants and the community of Henderson. And you know something? Nobody wanted to buy it. It was way too big. It was way too out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody wanted all of this. Now, Stauffer Chemical and various companies were willing to come in and take one portion of the plant, but nobody wanted this huge plant, the whole thing. It was way too much. So what ended up happening was, in the long run, eventually they worked out a deal, working with Pat McCarran, that the state Colorado River Commission bought the community of Henderson from the federal government and started selling it back to the community for twice the cost of the annual state budget. Now, I'm not quite sure, I never quite, yeah, it was an interesting deal, but he got it done. And as he would give them federal land, they could turn around, sell the federal land, and for subdivisions and that, they could use that money to pay off their debt through the Colorado River Commission to the feds, and then give or sell the land to the people who were living on the land, the people who lived in the houses, and then when they wanted to incorporate as a city, they talked Pittman, where people owned their property, into becoming part of the city of Henderson, because you had to have a certain number of landowners in your city, and they became part of the city, so Henderson could incorporate. Interesting thing was Pittman retained its post office. That was 1953. Pittman retained its post office until 1974. It didn't want to be part of Henderson, but it was part of Henderson. So I will move on to Jim at this point, but I'll give you an idea of where it worked in. You had to bring all the magnesite down here. It worked through the plant. The plant was very successful. May have cost the feds a bit too much, but it wasn't the only one. And we got Henderson out of the deal, which is where I've lived since I moved over here.
We got a few other things too, just very briefly. The
Oh,
first
yes,
water
yes.
pipeline in Lake Mead was put in
Yes.
by the plant, and they
Yep.
made it, at the time, they had the foresight to make it much bigger than they needed just for the industrial uses, because they knew this opportunity's not coming around again. And if I'm not mistaken, it was one of Nevada's generators in Hoover Dam also
Yes.
was paid for by this project. So some savvy folks were looking ahead when it came to infrastructure. And when you've got the chance to make hay with federal dollars, not a bad idea.
Nope. And by the way, the water did run down Water Street.
Oh.
The water pipeline.
Just a comment, I'm sure a lot of people, bear the same issue I'm going to tell you. My family moved here in 1949, and we lived in Harbor Park.
Mhm.
And the crew that you're talking about, something happened with my dad, long story short. So he got in the military, he got in the Air Force because of Nellis Air Force Base. That's how come we stayed.
Oh, yeah.
Because originally, it wasn't, but we were out there in Harbor Park in 1949.
Yep. And I think you're going to get that part now from Jim, because he's doing the military part. Yep.
Yeah, so let me just start out by giving my disclaimer for working for the federal government. My remarks do not reflect the views, stances, or official policies of the United States Air Force. They are my work as a historian. And so I'll start off and also offer my thanks to Clark County Museum and Henderson Historical Society for inviting us, and Eric and Mark for the opportunity to be part of the conversation. And for you, thank you for coming. We bill ourselves as the entertainment capital of the world. And you made a conscious choice to come hang out and be history nerds. So that's awesome. So of what significance were medals to the Army? In a post-war lecture in front of a military audience, a mining historian said, "If you were to strip an army of its medals, I suppose the first catastrophe would be taking the brass off the officers. But more serious would be removing the ordnance from the troops themselves." I think as Eric highlighted for us, where does our story begin? It begins before December 7th, 1941, right? On the military side, it will in part stretch back to the end of World War I. Following that war, the government, the Army's General Staff, is going to create the Harbored List. That's 42 minerals and items that are important to fighting a war that were in short supply during our short participation in World War I. The list is established, but there are no efforts yet to actually stockpile. That does not come for another 20 years. When we talk about this story starting in advance, the invasion into Poland is September 1939. President Roosevelt declares a state of an emergency a week later. By May of 1940, he is calling for the United States to produce 50,000 aircraft. In 1944, we produced 100,000 aircraft that year alone. It is going to take a tremendous amount of metal and alloys. I think another part of this conversation that is very interesting and lets us draw in the human aspect as you've talked about those who are doing work, as you're talking about the social conflicts that are part of that time as well. We're going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of independence later this year. When I think of the American Revolution, I think of the Minuteman. I think of the citizen soldier, right? For the most part, that individual could grab the accoutrements of war from home and volunteer. Even into the American Civil War, citizens can take things with them and go to war. Their horses will give them the opportunity to serve in the cavalry instead of marching in the infantry. But as we get to the 20th century, that's not the case. The doughboys and the GI Joes are not providing their own armaments. The government has to arm the military. If we look at 1939, Dow Chemical is the only manufacturer of magnesium, at least as the military looks at military goods. They are producing a grand total of 6 million pounds of magnesium per year. Sounds kind of impressive, right? Well, very quickly, that's going to expand from 6 to 12 to 18 to 89 to 400 with a reach goal of 600 million pounds of magnesium annually. They fall short of that 600 million and hit closer to around 500 million. That's an 83 times factor. Well, now you got to start figuring out, what do we need? So the government sends a survey out to the engine manufacturers. How much magnesium do you use? Like any good survey, the answers come back with a whole range of answers, anywhere from 0 pounds per engine to 379. Okay, we got an interesting story from Mark that's going to continue forward. How do we produce this stuff? How do we estimate how much magnesium is needed for aircraft? Well, we turn to the German manufacturers to figure out that they use anywhere from about 3.5% to 6.5% of the weight of the airframe is magnesium. So we're going to use those numbers, which are German, to figure out how much magnesium do we need for this initially 50,000 aircraft that we have to come up with. That'll become 100,000 aircraft per year. One company, 6 million. So we are immediately in a place where we don't have enough, right? And so here we come to stockpiling during a war. Or rather, instead of stockpiling, we have to build up the capacity as quickly as possible. So the government is going to work with Dow Chemical, and they are very interested in basic refractories because they're going to bring in a process from England. That's particularly interesting. This looks like it is a company that will add the number of processes. It will create a diversity in manufacturing, and that'll strengthen things. Dow will be asked to produce 128 million pounds annually, and Basic will be asked to produce 108. There are some sources that indicate it was 112. So when we're thinking about how did Basic Magnesium impact the war, they're given 28% share of that production. They're one of 2 companies that are the major producers of magnesium, and then we have 5 others that have given targets of 30 to 48 million pounds. So a lot of that emphasis is placed here. And Mark highlighted for us a lot of these challenges. This story is about trying to create industry out of almost nothing, going to that 83 times factor and going through the different challenges that come up with setting up those companies and getting that material forward. Now, the challenge is not just from the industrial side, right? We find those challenges from the government side as well. And so bear with me, because it's a little bit of a lengthy quote, but I think it illustrates the business side challenges of going to war. One official described the obfuscating process. It was entirely possible for ordnance to schedule the production of, say, 500 tanks per month in an arsenal. For the arsenal to apply on PRP for the material and be given 90% of steel and 80% of copper. For this 80% of copper to be reduced to 70% by the copper branch, and for some subcontractor making a vital part to only be given 60% of his materials requirement. Imagine being the customer and going through the work to figure out what you need, and you're handed 60% of what you need, but the deliverable hasn't changed, right? So as much as there are the challenges of operating the business, there are also those challenges of creating this industry that is going to then move stuff to war. It is a massive system. It's a system that changes a lot of things for Americans as well. But I'm going to highlight a couple of pieces that kind of get us into some of the use. And so there's two primary areas where magnesium is used, and that is going to be in airframes and incendiary bombs. And here, as Mark introduced for us, we come to a couple of the most difficult questions. Questions about the use of weapons and questions about air power theory. So magnesium is going to be a critical component in an incendiary bomb. An incendiary bomb is designed specifically to start a fire after it hits the ground. That's caused by exposing magnesium to the oxygen. So we no longer have just a 2,000-pound chunk of metal falling out of the sky to create a massive hole and blow something. That magnesium is now going to start a fire. Approximately 10% of Army Air Force operations were firebombing. The two most notable are going to be the firebombing of Dresden on the night of February 13th, 1945. And the estimates differ. The estimates suggest that it caused anywhere from 300,000 to 410,000 civilian casualties. On March 10th, so just only a month later, the firebombing of Tokyo, Japan, destroyed a quarter of the city and killed an estimated 83,000 civilians. Some have characterized those operations as military necessity. Others have critiqued them as poor choices. Some question whether or not firebombing in those particular mentions would constitute crimes. So we find that the story of magnesium also takes us to the story of the limits of a weapon. What is the appropriateness of that weapon? It also brings us to interesting questions about what air power contributes to war. Could destruction from above cause a bombarded people to convince their representatives to sue for peace? Early air power theorists writing in the 1920s and again at the outset of World War II in the 1940s were going to argue that strategic bombing is the next development in warfare, precisely because it can destroy an industrial base and that massive, quick destruction will convince a populace to turn to their elected representatives and surrender. Strategic bombing, in their theory, has the capability to end wars. Other theorists are going to argue the negative, and they're actually going to point to both of those campaigns. They would argue that victory in Europe does not come in February 1945, but in May. Victory in Japan does not come in March 1945, but rather in September. World War II does not offer us final answers to the questions of the limits and the use of weapons, nor of the role in air power. But I think it's important for us to note that the work that's being done right here addresses a couple of those very important big picture topics when we think about it. It's also going to take us into thinking about the idea of stockpiling as well. Production of magnesium is successful. The rollback on the restrictions is going to begin in mid-1943. By the end of 1943, the government says we have surplus magnesium. Material controls are completely withdrawn by October of 1944. So the war is not over in either theater, and the controls have been removed. The agencies and the programs that administered this are going to be disbanded by the end of 1945. The military is going to largely demobilize and send these young boys home. Congress will pass the first Stockpiling Act in 1946 and follow it up with the Defense Production Act of 1950 and similar legislation in 1953, 1954, and 1956. This very quickly becomes a whole of government effort. It includes the Departments of Treasury, Agriculture, Commerce, Interior, Defense, and the General Services Administration, and comes with a budget of $3.5 billion over 5 years. Sounds simple, but it's not. Think about the things that you store. If we simply stick something on a shelf, it has a shelf life. If we're going to stockpile certain materials, they cannot merely just sit on the shelf. You have to figure out how long they can stay there. We also come to the problem of, what does the next conflict look like? How much material will we need? What weapons will we go to war with? What losses will we have due to the inefficiency of process? What losses will we have to deal with as Basic Magnesium found out the hard way when their plans and initial equipment got torpedoed? If we rely on foreign sources, we have to put that into how we think about a stockpile. So early efforts to create that stockpile will be interrupted by the Korean War. Thinking about the cost, the military will switch from a 5-year plan down to a 3-year plan of what they're going to keep. And they'll actually declassify that program and end the first stockpile program in 1962. And interestingly enough, as we think about this story of surplus and the start of the Air Force, the then senator who leads that effort was a surplus administrator in 1946, and then the first secretary of the Air Force. I'll wrap up my portion by kind of drawing some lessons on magnesium itself, because magnesium highlights those challenges in stockpiling. I mentioned earlier that Dow Chemical begins the war as a default monopoly. Six other companies are spun up and then spun down. By 1949, Dow Chemical once again has a monopoly. A monopoly they actually don't want. So much so that they are giving information away to a competitor to try to get Eastern Stainless Steel started up. So Eastern Stainless Steel puts in $60,000 to brand new equipment, and their company goes through a labor strike, and they find out how hard it is to produce magnesium when only 260 of their first 1,700 magnesium sheets are accepted. The others are rejected, they're poor quality. So they try to use what happened in World War II. In World War II, the government absorbs all the cost, right? Think about all the things that Mark walked us through of you have thousands of laborers and you need a place for them to stay. We had a company that it's bringing equipment and plans over and it gets torpedoed. Now we got to rebuild that. Mark talked about those costs doubled, right? The government ends with not a high opinion of basic magnesium. So Eastern Stainless Steel goes to the Air Force and is hoping that they will cover the company's losses for the poor product in the first run and for this process of learning. The Air Force declines, and so Eastern Stainless Steel turns around, fires their president, reorganizes the company, and exits magnesium production. One historian looking at this in the 1950s concluded this: magnesium, along with aluminum, is one of the most important Air Force materials today. The best procedure in the long run would be to step up civilian consumption of magnesium to a high level. Then, the aircraft emergency procedure would be obvious. Discontinue civilian consumption on M-Day, just as aluminum consumption was discontinued during World War II. The problem was well articulated. The emergency solution was well articulated, but only as an emergency solution.
Amazing. So looking back, especially you guys have mentioned, we're going into America 250. So my question for all three panelists is kind of, as Eric hit at the beginning, is what are those lessons that we learned from this history that we can apply kind of to today? And how is our community different, and how would it react to that today, do you guys think? So an opinion question. Feel free to answer, any three of you to answer.
Okay. Not everyone at once here. I didn't want to
That's
step
the
on
first time I've
anyone's
stumped
toes.
Mark, so.
Well, I've got some strong opinions on this. I mean, so one of the things I think that if you're paying attention to the news today, you're hearing a lot about critical minerals, right? That's a phrase probably a lot. I'm getting some nods in the audience there. And critical minerals these days, it's a long, long list, and a lot of things that in the past maybe we didn't necessarily think of as critical are now on that list. But that's because there's something in the neighborhood of, 260 different minerals in one of these things, which, anthropologists would suggest that we clearly, this tribe called humans clearly has an affinity for strange rectangles that we carry around on our persons and look into all the time. Some kind of sorcery, probably.
It's a religious item.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So if you want to have things like that, let's say maybe you don't care for smartphones. Let's say you want, clean air. You want electric vehicles. You want bombs that function when your military drops them someplace. You want fighter jets that actually work okay. All of those things require minerals. Okay. So the policy since the 1960s, since the spin down of these strategic stockpiles, has been pretty clearly that magnesium is magnesium, copper is copper, lithium is lithium, and we should get it from the lowest price supplier, which makes sense, right? This is basic economics. We all understand how supply and demand works, right? And if there's no reason to spend extra money to get a thing that is literally a commodity. You can't tell whether that copper comes from Arizona or Utah or China. However, if the people on the other side of that equation don't want to sell it to you, now perhaps you've got a problem. So there's been an erosion of what I would think of as essentially mineral industrial capacity in the United States that has been a long time coming. This is like a 40 or 50 year problem. And it's not I think it would be easy to imagine that it's all foreign companies or foreign governments trying to, do the United States dirty, which there's a little bit of that, but quite a lot of it was American companies. And if you're an American company in the business of generating, say, lithium, and you've got some high-priced American mines and you've got some low-priced Bolivian mines, they're like, what is your responsibility to your shareholders, right? You get the ore where it's cheapest. So the upshot of all of this is that there's been a tremendous erosion in industrial capacity, and now, all of a sudden, we've, starting with the previous administration and accelerating in this one, we've sort of decided that this is unacceptable and we need to do something about it. Cool, okay, great. Good time to invest in mining stocks, by the way. But how? How do we do that? How do we reverse 40 or 50 years worth of neglect and really basically 30 years worth of somebody else having the technological lead that we thought that we had at one time? That's not an easy question, because now you've got to defy market economics, right? You got to spend, in other words, a lot of money on industrial processes that might be unproven. Maybe you make a great big plant to generate, lots of stuff. We could call it, say, lithium if you wanted to. And then the market goes and invents a kind of battery that doesn't use lithium. Now what? What are the taxpayers on the hook for, right? So these are questions that don't have easy answers. I don't have answers, God, goodness no. But as taxpayers, I think that we've got a stake in those questions, right? And so BMI, the history of BMI really offers us a really distinctive look at a moment when the United States was faced with questions and decided to answer them in a particular kind of way. I don't know that we'd answer them again that way for a bunch of reasons, right? But it certainly gives you something to think about.
It's interesting listening to what Jim was saying, because, and we didn't talk about it in this talk, but it puts me in mind of World War I here as well. We had a process in World War I where we were also doing strategic stockpiling, and we don't tend to think about that today, but in World War I, our strategic stockpiles were right along the railroad, and a lot of them were out at Jean. And if you know where Jean is, there's not much out there right now except supposedly the world's largest Chevron station. And a tower for no reason anymore, except to set it on fire every so often. But during World War I, they opened up the Potosi mine. They were taking zinc out of the Potosi mine. More zinc production from the state of Nevada came out of the Potosi mine in World War I than anywhere else in the state. And much of that came down to Jean, and they just piled it up in large piles right next to the railroad. And, they just stockpiled it there. They didn't do anything with it. It was just stockpiled there. And I've forgotten what the other ones were, but there were some other minerals that they were mining there. And their idea of strategic stockpiling at that point was just these large mounds of ore that they put right next to the railroad. I'm glad Eric's nodding on this one. But it's one of these things that we go through these wonderful things of, we need to do this. And so we rush in, we throw a lot of money at it, we deal with it, we get to the end of the war and we go, okay, all done. We throw these contracts out, throw a lot of money at them. World War I was even worse because we threw a lot of contracts at farmers, and all of this sent all the farm economy into a complete tailspin, and threw the farming economy in the United States into depression right after World War I. The Great Depression that we think of in 1929 for agriculture started 10 years earlier. But this is something I've thought about, because I look at the rare earths mine at Mountain Pass, and we have opened and closed and opened and closed and opened and closed that mine every time China has said, nah, you can't have any. it is a huge problem that the U.S. has to think about. And we are going to, at some point, come up with another kind of battery or whatever. And, I'm an historian. I don't know what they're going to figure out on these things, but we are going to have to figure this out. And I think that the U.S. is going to have to figure out what to do, and there's going to have to be a conversation that is intelligible to the general public. Part of the problem is a lot of this conversation is held, but it's held in mining magazines, in different areas, but it isn't held, I think, a lot of times in areas that a lot of us can access. And when it gets into general access places, it gets turned into conversations that are foolishness rather than something that brings all the pieces into the conversation. It's not just about whether, there's a plant that we need to worry about on that particular hill. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with worrying about the plants. That's not my issue. But we've got to take a much broader view of everything that's going on and make some well-reasoned decisions, and figure out what it is that we want to do. And we're going to do that when it becomes an emergency, which is the worst time to make the decision, because then we throw a whole bunch of money at it and end up with piles of rock next to the railroad. And or piles of sugar beets or whatever, because that's what happened in World War I. And it wasn't well done. If any of you have been to Pismo Beach stunk from rotting pumpkins, because there was a pumpkin flower plant there that was buying up every pumpkin they could get their hands on, and the war ended, and they had piles of pumpkins there for almost a year afterwards. That's why I say that. So there's a reason, and it does fit, but I understand it doesn't make any sense unless I explain that part of it.
So I'll echo that. I think I see at least two lessons. One is it's that complexity of the economics of stockpiling and the economics of war. One of the things that suppliers and industry was very worried about is during the wartime, you have this emergency, the government is here with contracts, buying up as much as possible, putting it into use, buying huge quantities. So we're going to ramp up all of that, but once the war's over, the demand is gone. Now there is such a huge surplus that the value sinks. All the estimates that we used to do business to make sure that we would pay our folks, make a profit, be able to invest in research and development, all of that's now gone. And stockpiling has the potential to cause the same sort of situation. That's one of the things that they are concerned about in the 1950s. If the government buys up its list, does that create a short-term artificial demand? If the government turns around and says one of those items has a shelf life, okay, we got to get it off the shelf and we're going to sell it. Are they now competing with those companies? Does that turn around and drive the price back down? So how does the efforts to, one, respond to war as an emergency or prepare for war as a future emergency, how does that impact our economies? The thing I think second, but something I think many of us already appreciate, but it's worth reminding, history is local. right? As we talk about these big ideas that impact what the United States does on a worldwide scale, there's a local tie-in, right? There are folks in our group here who have lived here, who have had a family member work at Basic Magnesium, who are a part of these events, right? So our history is close to us, and I think that's always important for us to convey, so it is not merely one of those topics we had to take in school, but it's also personal to us as we think about the 250th.
Perfect. All right. And at this point, I'd like to open up for questions. Any questions in the audience? All right. I'm going to start up close really quick. She got her hand up first.
I've always wondered, I worked at BMI actually for 10 years. But I've always wondered, with the plant starting in Henderson, understanding the power coming from the dam, the water coming from the dam, I'm sure that the railroad was important. Why didn't that start in Boulder City? Because they had a little community already going. How come it settled down in Henderson?
In order to have the space to build the plant, there wasn't space in Boulder City. They wanted to have it somewhere where they could build a plant the size of Basic Magnesium. And that was a huge amount of space there. They could not build it there. And to have the space to bring in the railroad along there, all of that, and then to build the community that was the size of the Basic town site, you could not do that in Boulder City. That it just could not be done there. They wanted an area that was not, there was nothing there. So yeah, it could not be done. They would have had, in fact, I don't think there was anywhere down there that they could have built all of that, and had it where they had Boulder City right next to it. It was much better having a space that was completely just virgin desert.
It was 2,800 acres. The first bulldozing was just enormous. And the other thing to remember too is that Boulder City at this time was still government property. This was officially private enterprise. It was private enterprise with an unlimited tap into Uncle Sam's checkbook, which is a little bit different, but officially it was private enterprise. And so in that sense, those were kind of incompatible land statuses, even though today it doesn't seem like there would be much of a difference.
The company considered your question. So there was some initial conversation about multiple locations, Boulder City, Las Vegas, even closer to the mine at gabbs. So the company was very much processing that exact consideration.
All right. Our next question.
First of all, I came from gabbs. I was born in Reno, but my dad worked in gabbs. He first started as a youth driver to bring the ore down from the mines, and then they shifted, of course, to Rooney, which the guy who did that was Don Anderson at the time. And then he went on to be a kiln foreman there in gabbs, to come here in 1952 to manganese.
Right.
So what was manganese? Was that anything to do with the magnesium?
No.
Great question. Manganese is one of those metals that helps make steel strong. And so there just happened to be a deposit over here, 3 kids. And a lot of those skills would have been transferable. Gabbs was an open pit mine, so the procedure in an open pit mine is pretty similar no matter where you go. And so if you knew what to do driving a uke, uke is mining shorthand for a Eucyrus, Euclid, I'm sorry. It's a Euclid.
Okay,
Eucyrus Erie is the other one. But a Euclid, which is one of these big haul trucks, and so sometimes they'll call them all ukes, just like we say Kleenex, But so if he had those kinds of skills, he would have been transferable pretty much anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, and they did use the manganese in nickels in World War II. So the 3 kids mine had a role in World War II, but it was in the nickels in 44 and 45.
It played out in 1962, because that's when my dad was like 75 and he went on work.
Yep.
And you may be pleased to know that manganese is back on the critical minerals list.
You know what?
I didn't realize that.
House says don't
Yeah.
All right, we got a couple other questions. Let's see. I'll start with you.
This is probably stupid, because I don't know that much about it, but it seems like if you have a stockpile of something, can you reverse some of it so it's stockpiled, so your shelf life is longer? You know, you understand what I'm saying?
It depends on what it is.
Oh,
If
okay.
it's just, bars of metal, then you're okay. But if it's a plant, or if it's something that's manufactured, most everything that you have, think about what you have in your house. Everything that you have has a certain lifespan.
Yes.
And so it depends on what you're keeping, and even on certain minerals in that, they will,
But some
That-
things, just like your freezer and your
So-
refrigerator.
Right.
So you have a shelf life in your refrigerator, but your freezer extends that shelf life.
Right,
That's what I'm saying, is there
So-
any kind of process like that they could?
yeah, and they do that.
So a grocery store, I think, would offer a good analogy, right? And if you're running the business side, take milk as an example, because it comes with a date on it, and most of us are not going to keep that milk after that date expires, right? So if you're the grocer, you don't want one delivery of milk that all expires on the same date. You want to be able to figure out, how much am I selling each day, and I'm trying to replace a portion of it, right? And then we're watching for the sales where that gets off skew, and we can go in and buy something extra cheap and still use it in time. That's very simplistic. That is something that they were looking at in that 1950s era and trying to figure that out. One of the challenges, though, is there's added expense to that, right? If I have to take my items that I am stockpiling, and I know, okay, every year on my 3-year scale, I've got to get rid of 33% of that and kick it back out in the market and buy a brand new 33% of that, that's going to have a lot of impact on prices and the consumer experiences of others. And I think that's part of why that initial program will start to go away and get declassified. It's expensive.
All right, we have our next question over here.
Yeah, well, my question has to do, I'm fantasizing that I'm a guy sitting in an office someplace, and this guy comes through the door and says, have we got a deal? We got this guy who makes brick in Cleveland who's got plans from England that sometimes he can find and sometimes he cannot, and we want to build this magnesium plant in the middle of God knows where that is. Wouldn't you like to sign off on this? And so somebody did, and I'm wondering who was it and how far up the food chain it went.
It went all the way to the top. Franklin Delano Roosevelt talked with Senator McCarran personally. McCarran went over there and haunted the White House, and FDR said, yeah, we can do that.
Thank you.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions.
So you're talking about today with essential metals and stuff like that. Do you think it's possible for a rearmament like what was done in the late 30s, being funded because of the New Deal and the RFC to be, and then if I remember right, I think it was a executive order to develop the Defense Plant Corporation that even allowed these thousands of plants to be built. Do you think that's even possible to be done today in our political world?
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of challenges, right?
Yeah.
So one of the big challenges is that wars aren't fought like they were back then. You know, that World War II and World War I before it were industrial wars. It was, some chemistry, but quite a lot of like metalworking. That's not how we fight wars today. We have a much smaller Air Force, for example, and those planes are just gigantically incredible. Like, they're so expensive and they are so capable. And we have the biggest asymmetry between, you know, our military and any others that there ever has been. So the wars themselves aren't the same. So I don't think the mobilizations would be the same. The products that you need for either society or war making or both are not quite the same either. The thing that strikes me as the biggest difference, and this would be the thing that I think maybe sticks to me just as one of those impossibilities, is that historians really point to the New Deal and those works progress type things as just a tremendously lucky kind of way of making work for people. What ended up happening is we had all this surplus in the West in particular, all this surplus infrastructure. You know, we had a huge dam over here which was generating power that no one could use and backed up an enormous lake full of more water than anyone knew what to do with. The same was true in the Pacific Northwest, for example, and also in California. And so there's a reason why Boeing and the aircraft industry grew so strong in the Pacific Northwest. It's because aluminum, like magnesium, takes a lot of electricity. That electricity was there from things like the Grand Coulee Dam and the Bonneville Dam that no one knew what to do with, right? So there was this opportunity, this kind of infrastructural opportunity that was posed by the Great Depression and the New Deal. And I don't see that happening anymore, right? We don't build more than we need because we want to put people to work anymore. That's not the way that the system of capitalism that we exist in today functions, right? We focus on much tighter margins, much more attention to quarterly profits and things like that. So I can't imagine that we ever spend the extra to get to the infrastructure part that allows those things to happen sort of fast the way that they did in the 40s.
So I don't have any insight on what the future will look like, but I'll offer just kind of a thought. And think about the structure of the Air Force. And so the next subdivision down is what we call a major command. And one of those major commands is Air Force Material Command. They are very focused on research and design. And they are very focused on what does the warfighter need in the future. So the process from military in-house of what will we need in the future, how do we go about those things, that is a part of day-to-day life for the Air Force and for the other services as well.
All right, do we have any other questions? All right, last question, and then we'll wrap it up.
I have a simple question. I want to know, where is BMI still in operation today?
No. BMI closed down in 1944. There is a BMI, but that's basic management. It just uses the same initials. It's not basic magnesium. That company is gone now. Basic management handles the management of the grounds there, but it's not the same company.
What's the location of it? Well, the cross streets. Like, is it by Lake Mead Parkway?
It's all the large plants that are along Lake Mead Boulevard, and the oddity is when you go along Lake Mead Boulevard next to Henderson, it's actually in Clark County. That portion is not in Henderson. When you're looking at Boulder Highway and Lake Mead Boulevard, all those huge plants there, that's when I'm talking about, and we're all talking about basic magnesium, all those buildings along there, not the new ones on the other side, not on Warm Springs, not that side, but the ones along Lake Mead Boulevard, those buildings are all basic magnesium buildings from World War II.
And my last question, I heard you say Culver City. Is that near here? What is that? Culver.
Carver Park, maybe?
Carver Park.
Carver-
Carver Park was the housing that was built for the black workers at basic magnesium. However, it opened so late that most of the black workers already had housing elsewhere, and it was later housing for, though a few did live there. Later on, it was taken over by the county and used for low-income housing. And there is only one building left of the original Carver Park. It is the Elks Lodge there. It was originally the single male
Like a dormitory?
what?
Bachelor housing?
Yeah, it wasn't a dormitory, it was the eating area.
Cafeteria.
Which, yeah, the cafeteria, yes, thank you. And yes, mess hall as well. I can tell the military person here. But yes, that's the only building left from the original Carver Park.
All right, I lied. I have one more question from the audience.
So, every time I hear about a world war, they always say the war that will end all wars.
Well, that was World War I, and it didn't work.
Yes, but all these problems that we have, you know, you have to ramp up production for a war that might be coming, and, you know, the stockpiles and blah, 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 blah. Did they ever find a way or figure out how wars would end, and if they could ever end?
So, yeah, it's a human problem, right? Wars are not something that merely happen to us. You know, one of the things that we often look at as historians is we look for those causes, and we look for the nuances and the complexities in that. You know, I think I could safely make a prediction that no, I don't think wars will end, because I don't think human conflict will end. If you can make all the humans in the entire world all get along with each other, that might do it. But I don't think anybody has figured out what that pathway is.
I shouldn't have laughed, and mainly because I agree with Jim on that. I do believe that wars will end, but it'll probably happen when the sun explodes and we're all gone. I don't mean that, I don't mean that to be, flippant. I've spent my life in history. I've been dealing in history, running museums and that all of my career. And, we've been doing this for way too many centuries. And it doesn't matter which group, people find a way not to get along with each other. And I don't care whether it's a war among countries or it's a committee of people in your business, it just happens. Doesn't make it right, that's why we keep trying not to do it. And, but it's just something that, for whatever reason, there's always somebody that thinks that they know best, and the only way to do that is to make damn sure you don't get to. So, I wish.
All right. Thank you guys, and thank you guys for all participating. Give a round of applause for the panelists again.